Delavain, thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is really meant to be a conversation more than a talk. So please feel free to jump in, interrupt, ask questions, and otherwise I'll go 20 or 25 minutes and then we can really get into a back and forth. So I do want to take you back now 25 years to the conversations and negotiations that led up to the Convention on Climate Change. And the argument I want to make to you all is that we got going in a certain direction that reflected a 20th century model of how to do environmental protection, and that we are now, I hope, on a different trajectory. But in that moment 25 years ago, I remember as a young official with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency being taken aside by the great Canadian environmental leader, Maurice Strong, who some of you will recall was the Secretary General of that Rio Earth Summit of 1992, at which this Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed and brought to a conclusion. And Maurice Strong took me aside and said, as he was trying to pull all the pieces together, and particularly of that climate change agreement, and he said, Dan, you have to remember one thing. When we gather in Rio, and whenever you bring 100+ presidents, prime ministers, their cabinets, the media, the non-governmental community together, there are only two outcomes that are possible: success and real success. And at the time, I didn't really think about it, and later I realized, after believing that I had helped negotiate a solution to the climate change problem in 1992, which led me to think I could leave government and go back to Connecticut and become a professor at Yale. And then I watched more than 2 decades of success with relatively little done to deliver real success and a transformed energy future. And that's really the topic I want to talk about today. What did we get off on the wrong step with in 1992, and where are we now? And I would argue that I think we're in a much better place after the Paris Agreement of 2015. And so very quickly, 10 shifts that I think give us some reason for optimism about where we are today compared to where we've been over the last 2 decades. So number one, and this is a problem not just of the original 1992 Climate Change Convention, but more broadly about the strategy of environmental protection in the 20th century, was that it was very top-down. And we had a sense that national governments, presidents and prime ministers were the key players. And I think it turned out, particularly on climate change, but even more broadly, that presidents and prime ministers have relatively little control over the carbon footprints of their society. So one of the fundamental shifts in Paris, and I think very profound and important one, was the broader engagement, the bringing into the conversation of mayors, premiers, governors, subnational political leaders, and second, and perhaps even more importantly, the business community. And so this is a very important shift of gears. And I think that broader engagement, understanding that a lot of what needs to be done is really city scale or state policy scale, is going to, I think, make a difference as we go forward. Number two, we made in Rio in 1992 in the Framework Convention what I like to call the lawyer's mistake. And that was that we set targets and timetables and thought that that would change behavior. Well, it didn't. It turns out we paid far too little attention to what the incentives for real changes in behavior would be. We ended up with a lot of targets and timetables that were missed, instead of really structure of incentives that would do things very differently going forward. I think we've now learned that lesson. We've learned that, again, the core environmental model of the 20th century was what we now call command and control regulation. Governments mandating outcomes. And that worked in some ways and in some places, but has reached its limits. And we now, I think, get that we need a 21st century model that is much more sharply focused on innovation and on incentives for changed behavior and transformation more broadly. And that involves, in many cases, I think, more use of market mechanisms, of price signals, and frankly, of engaging the business community, not just as the problem to be addressed, but as solutions providers, as a critical pathway to innovation. And I do think we saw that in Paris. We saw the business community stepping up. We saw individual business leaders. Paul Pullman of Unilever was mentioned yesterday, and I think he's done a remarkable job of bringing a different strategy to business and of embedding in Unilever a sustainable living plan that I think is now a core dimension of the strategy of that company. And even more broadly, we had business coalitions present in Paris, the We Mean Business Group, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and I think that very much helped change the frame of the conversation and got us with the critical sector, the business sector, that is the source of most of the emissions, thinking about problem solving. And that was very, very helpful. A fourth dimension of the transformation I think we now have in place that overcame a terrible mistake made in Rio and actually locked in at the time of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was the dividing of the world into an Annex 1 list of countries that took on obligations and a non-Annex 1 list of everybody else who did not take on real obligations and who viewed themselves as invited to sit on the sidelines and wait for the developed nations to do the work. And far too many of them did sit on the sidelines for more than 20 years. As we heard this morning from the president, ex-president of the Maldives, and most of yesterday, much of the price paid for inaction falls on the developing world. So it turned out to be a terrible mistake to allow anyone to sit on the sidelines. And it was not just that the people most affected were not out fighting for their future, but it created a political logic in particularly the United States for inaction. Because the wing of people in the US political spectrum who wanted not to take action said, well, why should we act when our major and rising trade competitors like China and India are not asked to take action? So let's not move forward. And that logic prevailed up until very recently. So I think the transformation to bring business into this conversation was very, very important. I think it's also turned out, and this is what this Green to Gold book that is here, or the Green to Gold business playbook sitting in the back, talk about, the corporate world has come to understand that there's lots of reasons to think about environment broadly, climate change in particular, as a core dimension of strategy. And I think you're seeing a growing number of companies take action, both because it reduces risk and can lower costs. So if you're energy efficient, you have lower costs. If you're managing climate change, you're less likely to be exposed to price signals that come into the market or actual physical change in your marketplace. If you're in an agricultural business, I think I saw Forbes here, you got to be careful that you don't end up with reduced rainfall and the inability to get the crops you want or to produce the livestock you need. So actual physical change is an exposure for some industries. And third, I think a lot of companies have come to understand that there are growth opportunities, not just from solving your own energy and environment problems, but from selling solutions to your customers. So if you solve your customers' environmental challenges, you have the potential to really be seen as providing a value-added product and increase your top-line growth, your revenue, and your bottom-line growth, your profitability. And fourth and finally, a lot of companies, I think, today understand that they want to have the kind of intangible value embedded in their brand of being seen as attentive to sustainability broadly or to climate change in particular. They want to connect to the customer base that might care about this. They want to be seen by investors as attentive to this issue, as a signal that management is smart and on top of the complexities of the day. And perhaps even most importantly, a lot of companies recognize that the key to success is the ability to attract knowledge workers. And one of the profound differences of knowledge workers compared to everyone else is they want to align their professional lives with the values of the companies they work for. And all of you, I know, believe that. You don't want to work for somebody who you think's, for a company that's seen as a bad actor. So the ability to kind of drive forward and remain profitable and successful depends in part on this idea of positioning in a way that's seen as attentive to society's issues. So I think we're seeing a change in the world in important ways, and business is part of that shift. I would say even more broadly, but related, is a change in finance and how we are going to deliver the capital needed for a decarbonized future. And the 20th century model, frankly, was, and I think we heard some about this yesterday, and I was disappointed that it was not critiqued by more of you, but was overseas development assistance, foreign aid. And this is just so 20th century and so demonstrably unsuccessful that I think it should have been pushed harder when it was put forward as a way forward. It turns out that governments never come up with the money necessary for the scale of change required. They make commitments and don't follow through, and it becomes a huge source of tension and a source of failure, because you're not getting the scale of capital you need to really build out the energy efficiency investments needed, the renewable energy structures, the grid modernization, the investments in microgrids and storage, and all dimensions of a transformed energy infrastructure. The 21st century model that I think the Paris Agreement starts to signal, and more broadly we now understand, is that we should use limited government money to leverage private capital. And what you're really trying to do is to get to scale on the flow of capital into the build out of a clean energy future. And the scale is huge. The estimates are trillions of dollars over the next decade. So, hundreds of billions of dollars all across the world. And I think what we now recognize is that requires, again, and this is the spirit of what I think is now available to us compared to our picture of how to go forward 20 years ago, is about innovation. And it turns out it's not just innovation in terms of technology, it's innovation in policy, in incentives, and in finance. And I think we're starting to see that with a real emphasis on green banks. I mentioned briefly yesterday, Connecticut has set up a green bank, Britain has set up a green bank, a number of other countries and subnational jurisdictions. Green bonds, we're suddenly seeing tens of billions of dollars of green bonds issued. And I think we do see really a very different expectation in terms of where capital is going to come from. I think we're also seeing philanthropy play a bigger role. One of the big announcements at the Paris negotiations in December of 2015 was by the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, Bill Gates and a number of other billionaires who committed $2 billion to innovation investments to try to drive toward a clean energy future. Now that $2 billion actually is about equal to all of the money collected by the Green Climate Fund, which is the world community's, all governments' commitment of capital. There's $10 billion in pledges to that Green Climate Fund. Only $2 billion in change have actually come in. A number of the pledges are out over time. $3 billion of the pledging is from the United States government, not one penny of which will arrive in the next 4 years. So it turns out different sources of capital, different structures of funding are going to be essential. Again, another point related is that how you deploy that capital has also shifted. The 20th century model was government subsidies for preferred companies, industries, sometimes technologies. And overall, that strategy has not delivered good results. It turns out that governments don't play the role of venture capitalists very well. They don't bet based on market promise and the ability to really spot innovation, but on other factors. And just to draw a couple of examples here. The US government has actually invested more than $25 billion in one big alternative energy strategy. Does anyone know what that is? Correct. Corn-based ethanol. And how's it worked? Almost not at all. It turns out it takes 3 units of fossil fuel inputs to get 4 units of corn-based ethanol out of the system. So you get almost no energy benefit. You create a food-fuel trade-off. You create a tension over rising prices as you bid up the price of corn, which bids up the price of many other products that have corn embedded in it. And by the way, this is all complicated and people don't really notice if the price of hamburger goes up because there's a lot of corn in beef. And they don't even notice really when the price of wheat goes up because it's now got a number of wheat farmers switching to corn. I would say there was a little bit of a notice when the price of hops and barley went up and the price of beer started to rise. But in general, these are complicated things and people don't get how unsuccessful this was. And the second big example is, have any of you tracked the performance of the US government's investments in clean energy? Does anyone know a big success? Or how about a failure? Everybody knows Solyndra. And it turns out the failures get a lot of attention when governments place bets and the successes don't. So even though the US government track record is not so bad, the political view of it is very bad. And why, by the way, did the US government continue to bet billions and billions of dollars on corn-based ethanol long after it became clear that it was not a good strategy? I heard the word. It's Iowa, and the fact that our presidential selection process begins in Iowa every 4 years. And Democratic and Republican candidates troop through every 4 years and promise to maintain corn subsidies for ethanol in a strategy that is purely politically motivated and has little to do with delivering a clean energy future. I promise you that throwing darts at a dartboard, I could have spent $25 billion better in terms of delivering clean energy investments than putting it all into corn-based ethanol. So it's really not a good strategy. So again, 21st century strategy is think about how government can play the role of de-risking the flow of private capital to investments that have public paybacks as well as the promise of a private return. So you're really saying, investor, let's get your next 100 million focused on solving a public problem, the need for clean energy, as opposed to invested in something that has a purely private return, the next video game. So how do you do that? Creative and innovative policy. And just to give you a couple of quick examples, in the state of Connecticut, we created this green bank, and the green bank the goal was to use a limited flow of public funds to ramp up dramatically deployment of renewable energy and energy efficiency retrofits. And it turns out that the old model is the government would just pay half the cost of anyone who did a project. You did a $30,000 solar array on your roof, the government would give you a $15,000 rebate. Now, when I came into government, I said, well, if we have $30 million a year and we use that model, it looks like I'm constrained at $60 million of deployment a year. So I said to the governor, I want to totally transform this model. And he said, great, your only constraint is you get no more money, which, by the way, is the constraint of governments everywhere today. So it's going to require creativity to redeploy existing funds to drive new programs. So what we did was to set this green bank up, and the green bank went to private sources of capital and said, we want you to put the money in. And they all said, happy to do it. Renewable energy, clean energy, very risky proposition. Our risk committee says, we're going to have to charge you 10, 11, 12% interest rates. And I said, at 12%, no one does any projects. So this is not going to work. How are we going to get low interest rates, 5 or 6%? And they said back to me, well, we can't do it with this high risk. Our risk committee's meeting. There's no track record. It's all very complicated, very risky, which, by the way, is not true. There is actually a pretty good track record, which we knew, they didn't. And so this is a role of government to fix market failures and to fix information failures in particular. So I said to them, okay, we'll share the default risk with you. I actually made a mistake and said we would take the first couple of percent of default risk. And then into the conversation, I realized that was an error. What we really needed to do was to ask them, what's the usual default risk? And they said 1 to 1.5%. And I said, okay, you take the first percent of default risk, the Connecticut Green Bank takes the second, third, and 4th% of default risk. Why is that important? Who knows?
Because otherwise I'll get to 3 and 4.
Well, otherwise there's what academics call moral hazard. They won't pay attention to how they're spending the money because someone else is taking all the risk. So you hold them on the hook to make every loan count, every loan properly vetted. But now they feel that if there is an experience beyond the usual, the second, third, and 4th% of risk is covered. So they said, oh, this is now risk-free. We'll do it at 5.99%. And the number of projects you do at that interest rate versus double, totally transformed. Why? And this leads to the second lesson. It turns out at interest rates of around 6%, you can make every project cash flow positive. And especially from a business point of view, this turns out to be what's critical. They don't even care what the interest rate is. They only care about whether the money they're spending each month to pay back their energy loan is an amount that not only justifies but is better than what they would have paid on their energy bill. So if you can reduce the energy bill by $1,000 a month, and they're only paying $600 a month on their energy loan, businesses say, great, we'll do it. And that's what Connecticut found, tenfold increase in these projects, because almost every business guy said, no brainer, cash flow positive, we can do it. The private capital was dramatically much more available than the limited government money. And who would like to guess how many dollars now of default coverage the state of Connecticut Green Bank has paid out in 5 years? Answer is $0. Now, there have been a few defaults, all within the 1%, no massive default structure. Turns out that these are very secure loans. The solar arrays are generating power that can be sold. The energy efficiency projects, again, properly vetted, almost all reduce costs more than they actually incur in terms of payback on the loan. So changed model, business-like model of driving forward, I think offers the promise of much more on-the-ground success. And that, by the way, is another dimension of what's different about the Paris Agreement versus prior climate change focus. The past was too much of this spirit of let's set the targets and let people go. Today, there's a lot of focus on solutions, on-the-ground change, and measuring success not in visions set out, but in transformation that actually occurs. And I think that's more broadly a very big deal. And supporting that, another dimension of the Paris Agreement, again, what I would call part of our 21st century strategy of sustainability, is a lot more emphasis on metrics. You actually want to track progress quantitatively. And again, from a business point of view, this seems so obvious. Why do businesses do accounting? So they can manage. And that we thought we could run environmental policy without careful metrics? Unimaginable now. And by the way, the 21st century has got a data capacity and a possibility that is so much greater than before, that it really represents one of the fundamental breakthrough opportunities. And I see several of the folks who I was able to engage over dinner last night in thinking about this opportunity. What would it take to really drive 21st century data analytics into the realm of sustainability? And I think it is going to be a huge part of how we deliver a sustainable future. Because it turns out, again, one of the problems of the old model of climate change, frankly, the whole model of 20th century environmental protection, is we didn't have a way to make people do what they said they were going to do. We didn't have a structure of enforcement. In the Paris Agreement, we now have a required metrics reporting structure and every 5-year stock taking. We're going to make people report and explain what's worked, explain what hasn't worked. With that, we'll identify leaders who are delivering on what they promised, be able to shame laggards who are falling behind, and by digging a layer deeper, extract out the best practices of those who are leading, and then disseminate them. And all of that is how you get people to innovate and transform when you don't have a police force or an enforcement mechanism that can make them do it. And this is very important. So information, metrics, data, and analysis as the tool for delivering success is a very big breakthrough from where we were 25 years ago. A couple of other quick points that I think make us on a better trajectory today than we were. And you heard it already, both this morning from the president of the Maldives and somewhat yesterday. 1992, we were not allowed to talk about adaptation. Literally, our delegation instructions were focus on mitigation. Any talk about adaptation is seen as surrender, giving up, we've lost the game. I think that was a huge error. We lost 20 plus years in getting organized for the inevitable degree of climate change we're going to face and the need to prepare for it. It also reflects, I think, a philosophical and political mistake. And that is, if you care about change and you're trying to drive innovation, you should not constrain where the search for pathways forward goes. So I think there's a lesson here, which is going to jar some of you, but I'm going to say it anyway, because another of the important things I've learned is that political correctness is deadly to innovation, because it again constrains where people are willing to look for solutions. So 1992, we had to focus on mitigation. We couldn't talk about adaptation. Paris Agreement, 2015, adaptation is now on the agenda. Everyone acknowledges it, but there's still a skunk at the garden party that no one will acknowledge, geoengineering. And I think you've got to take it seriously because you don't know where the breakthroughs are going to come from. Is it promising? I don't think so. But I'm happy to have some other people bet some amount of their money on these strategies. And one of the things that I would say we've learned, profoundly learned, in the intervening 25 years is that diversity is critical to innovation. I mean, diversity is now a huge value more broadly and an important value. One of the things I realized looking out at this incredibly diverse audience is that had I been invited to this conversation 25 years ago, I do see two other people that would have been here, and they both would have looked like me. In fact, half of you couldn't have been here at least 35 years ago, and many of others of you wouldn't have been here. So we've learned that diversity is profoundly important to the ability to look at problems from different perspectives and to attack them with full vigor. And so I would say that's another huge lesson, and one that argues for an open mind as to where the path forward is going to come from and where it's going to lead to. And that brings me to two last points. I think in Paris, we have an agreement that does something very, very important that was missing from what I call the 20th century model of environmental protection. And that 20th century model was focused, law and policy, on what I call red lights, stop signs, telling people what they couldn't do, particularly what the business community couldn't do. Don't do this, don't do that, don't pollute. It turns out, just as a street sign or street control that had only red lights and no green lights, we were missing the incentives that would tell people what they should do, where they should go, what we needed them to do to solve pollution problems. So the 21st century, and the Paris Agreement begins this, is about incentives to engage problem solvers, particularly the business community, in bringing us breakthroughs in renewable energy, breakthroughs in the finance of renewable energy, breakthroughs in energy storage, which is critical to baseload renewable energy. And all of that requires signals of a variety of kinds, green lights as I call them, to say to people, go forward, solve this problem. Bring your entrepreneurial talent, your creativity, your spirit of innovation to bear on this problem set. So I think the move from a red light framework to one that has red lights and green lights, profoundly important. And that really brings me to my last point about why this Paris Agreement, I think, gives me promise. And for saying this, I will probably have my invitation revoked and Delavane will be asked to shut me down. But it is that the spirit of Paris was one of optimism. And if I have learned anything in my experience as a political leader, as a policy leader, as a change student and academic, and watching those who I think have succeeded, it's that they were optimistic. They offered the promise of something better going forward. So if we are told that the world is going to be diminished, smaller, less interesting, less exciting, or for the developing world, not open to the same material gains that have been available to the developed world, you're constraining people and it's not exciting. It's not where they want to go. So the promise of something that's going to be more diverse, more interesting, maybe not more extensive in consumption, but more intensive, is very profoundly important. And that Paris Agreement generated a spirit, a changed psychological frame after really a decade plus of people thinking this problem's too big, we can't solve it, we're not doing well. The spirit coming out of Paris is we're actually rounding a corner, or maybe it's rising on a trajectory. We hit an inflection point. And it turns out that the business world, and the capital markets in particular, are in the business of forecasting where the world is going. So if the environmental community sits around and says it's all going to hell in a handbasket, we're all about to go off a cliff, they'll project a future off a cliff. If you say it's onward and upward, we're headed for a decarbonized future, clean energy is emerging, they will invest as though that were true. So it turns out, and this is again a profound leadership point, optimism is essential to success and self-reinforcing. And so what's going to get my invitation revoked is I think the title of this whole conference, 1.5, is at risk of creating a sense of failure rather than success. And I think you've heard it from several speakers. We should say, and I have no problem with ambitious targets. 2 degrees is our target, 1.5 would be even better, let's go there. But if you start to say, oh, we have only 5 years to do this, it's hopeless, we can't get there, it's impossible, it looks like it's all over, you create a different psychology and a negative spirit. So I really do think the next one of these should be titled something like Rounding the Bend to a Clean Energy Future, or On the Inflection Point to a Decarbonized World Ahead. So bottom line is, I think we have turned a corner. And I want to say one more thing and then open this up to a conversation. The other lesson that I have learned, and it's profoundly important to a group like this, is that leadership matters. Why we got a better result out of the Paris conversation in December of 2015 and the run-up to it than we got in prior efforts, including for any who've studied this, you would know that in 2009 there was a big push rising to the crescendo at the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties at the end of that year to try and seal the deal on a new climate agreement. Totally failed. And why? Lack of leadership. The Danes in particular did a miserable job organizing the event. I'm sorry if anyone here is Danish, or we probably haven't expanded the scholarships yet to Denmark, so that's got to be put on the list. Terrible leadership by Denmark. They put the meeting in a bad place. It had only 4 entryways, and we have 4,000 delegates. The security lines were 2 hours long. It rained. People were very angry by the time they got in the hall. They were wet, they were soaked, they'd been held outside. The food was terrible. You laugh. The other point, profound point I will tell you, is that people who are feeling good feel better about the future and negotiate to success. People who are angry, and it's hard to negotiate. And by the way, important point for any of you who get into negotiations, where does the conversation actually take place? Not in the plenary hall. So if you're asked to go sit in the plenary hall, which I was as a young EPA official several times, you're having a bad day. Because in the plenary hall, people are reading canned delegation instructions. And I always felt, gosh, couldn't they have just faxed these into me? I could have taken my notes and submitted them and then spent the day in the park. But no, if you're the junior guy, you sit there taking notes all day. Where's the real negotiation? On the margins is what we call it, in the hallway, in the breakout rooms, in the like-minded groups that are meeting in different places to coordinate policy, and even more, over lunch. And that's where that good food comes in. And even more, at the bar at the end of the day. I can't tell you how much of the Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992 was worked out at the bar in Rio, where, because it was Rio, we had a long evening. We could go to dinner at 11 and still be going at 3 in the morning, no problem. And there were a whole series of us, special assistants to ministers, who sat at the bar, worked out deals, and then said to our minister bosses, try this out tomorrow morning. Propose this. And the bosses were always shocked that everyone else agreed. But the special assistant had worked it out at the bar. And we knew that if Brazil did this, Canada would do that, and Sweden would agree to this, and you could get a whole package pulled together. But it was partly because there was a lot of informal space in Rio in '92 and fantastic informal negotiating space in Paris in 2015, including, by the way, pop-up restaurants from some of Paris's finest chefs. So you're hearing a little bit of a joke, but not really. This is how you get success. Other leadership that occurred in Paris that made a difference, the Pope. The papal encyclical of July 2015, you did not have to be Catholic to understand the importance of that statement about a world of the future that we owed a debt to, that we were spiritually, in whatever way people took that, in a relationship with future generations. And one of the failures of the past is the prevailing model of both economics and business that's very short term. Climate change requires long-term thinking. And I think the Pope helped frame the conversation by saying, every one of us owes this to the future. Profound point. And a second point, which jarred me a little at the time, because he was a little hostile towards market mechanisms, but the idea that it's also got to be an environmental commitment embedded in a focus on economic justice, because you can't really get one done without the other. So that link, profound. Ban Ki-moon. This guy, as the UN Secretary General, had so many problems weighing him down, and yet throughout those negotiations, he kept climate change moving. Heroic effort, underappreciated, but will be remembered over time. President Obama, after completely blowing it at Copenhagen in 2009, again, you guys, I was told we're all 15 years old at this point, so you don't remember it. but it was hugely embarrassing. And the new American president comes to the meeting. His staff had let him down. He had no agreement. He pulls out a yellow legal pad and starts jotting down an agreement. When the president of the United States has to do the negotiation, you know you've failed. It was a disaster. By 2014-15, President Obama has a vision. He's putting political capital behind it. And most importantly, he got together with the Chinese. And so we had the two biggest problem countries agreeing to take action together. And that, again, transformed the psychology of those negotiations, because a whole lot of countries that have been laying in the background saying, well, we don't have to act because China and the US aren't acting, were forced into the foreground. Number one on that list being India, who loved the fact that the Chinese and the Americans were getting all the blame and they could hide. And once the Chinese and the Americans stepped up, India had to as well. So again, transformation of the psychology of the negotiation. Chinese president gets credit. He had concluded, having been a problem at Copenhagen in 2009, that China would be part of the solution. And I think he concluded, for domestic policy reasons, that a lot of the same things you do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions would help reduce air pollution in Chinese cities. So again, it made sense, but give him credit as well. I think the other quick points, the developing world. Developing countries had finally come to understand that they shouldn't and couldn't sit on the sidelines, and therefore came to Paris ready to take action. 193 countries showed up. 188 came with nationally determined contributions, their own action plans to moving forward on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So everybody on the field, everybody in the game, again, profoundly important. The mayors and governors and premiers and local government leaders that came ready for action, organized in a summit within the negotiation by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, extremely valuable. And in fact, Mayor Anne Hidalgo is now the head of a group called the C40, Mayors for Climate Action. Now, by the way, 90 mayors. But they're demonstrating that action will proceed at the city scale, no matter what goes on at the national scale, where in a number of countries it seems to be not very promising. Same was true with governors and premiers, organized in a group called the R20 by former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And lots can be done and is being done now at that state, province, or subnational scale. And finally, again, as I started with and I want to end with, the business community came ready to act and ready for change and ready to commit resources to change. And I think that gives us a much more promising path forward. So I close by saying I think we are in a climate change strategy now that's got much broader engagement. It's got a whole commitment to green lights as well as to stop signs and red lights. It's got a central focus, and again, this is what I think is core, on innovation and not just technology change, but a whole structure of fresh thinking about finance, incentives, government action, public engagement, all of which lead me to think we're on a better place going forward. So let me stop there and invite critique, comment, questions. Push forward, push back, please.
One question, you talked about Paris, and it's a wonderful model to look to. But now we've gone to Morocco. It seems to me that very little happened in Morocco in the last year. And now we're going to Bonn. And I'd like your comments on what you feel is going to happen. Are we going to be able to do anything? Because we're now at a stage where we need to do something very concrete. So
There's a lot being done, but it's not being done by national government negotiators that showed up in Morocco or in Bonn. But that's not where the story is. It's the mayors, it's the governors, it's the business leaders, it's the finance mechanisms. It's frankly the fact that you've now got a whole set of folks that are trying to develop metrics of corporate performance to inform consumers about which companies are providing good products, provide investors a way to score companies on what's known as their ESG performance, environment, social governance performance. And a growing number of people are saying, well, if the national government can't deliver the outcome I want, then I have to take it on my own hands and buy as an informed consumer and invest as a sustainability investor. And really, and by the way, a third dimension is there's now efforts being made, and this is most important in the United States, to identify the political contributions of companies so people can say, wow, I don't want to buy from a company that then takes the money I paid them and invests it in anti-climate change action. So I think the 21st century capacity to bring metrics and data and transparency to bear allows us to keep progress going even where a number of national governments are not doing very well. And number one being the US government, but Britain is not doing so well in a Brexit mode. And by the end of the day, the French may be in a very bad place.
So that's what I'm worried about, is the money that is needed from the national government.
The money from the national governments is unimportant to success. It's always been too small. It's always been measured in small billions. Again, the Green Climate Fund, the big investment of national governments put together even before Paris, has total pledges of $10 billion spread over 5 years. The actual amount of money needed is 100 times that, and it's coming not from national governments. That's an unimportant part of the pathway forward. It's coming from the private sector and private capital.
Yeah, I had a question. Your green bank example is really interesting. I had a question on how you convince other, like just broader banks, because I assume other states in the U.S., especially that are not Connecticut, might not have green banks. How do you convince them to reduce the cost of capital on some of these green projects? Because you said it's an information problem.
So it's a really good question, and part of it is, when I put this together, I never talked about climate change. Because one of the things, again, you all heard Bill McKibben, and he and I went to college together, so I've known him for almost 40 years. And he and I talk across this issue in ways that intersect, and he wants to win the political argument. And he wants, his measure of success is when the guys obstructing climate change progress confess error. And if I can offer you any other point of experience in my now 35 years working in this field, is you almost never get the other guys to give up and say I was wrong. So instead, change the frame of the conversation. And that's what we did with the Green Bank. I didn't say we're out to drive climate change and improve the greenhouse gas emissions profile of Connecticut. What I said was we're going to deliver a clean energy future. In fact, what I said, we're going to deliver a cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable energy future. And to that, a much broader political sweep could rally. And the package I put forward to drive this clean energy agenda, including the Green Bank, was adopted unanimously by the Connecticut State Senate. So every Republican voted yes, as well as every Democrat. And out of 151 state representatives, only 5 voted no, 3 of whom later said they meant to vote yes, but it was late at night, hard to know what button to press, it's very confusing. But we ended up with, and again, very important question and very important point, we ended up with all parts of the political spectrum invested in the success of this project and this new model of how to flow capital to clean energy. And the other thing I will tell you is it turned out I'd made a lot of mistakes. And so 2 years into the creation of this Green Bank, I had to go back to the state legislature and say, please help me fix this and fix that and fix this other thing. Had I shoved this down the throats of the Republican Party, which I could have done because the Democrats had a very strong majority in both House and Senate, then the Republicans, when I had to come back and say I'd made a mistake, would have said, as you see in the US Congress all the time now, why would we want to help you? You guys were jerks and pushed this down our throats. We're instead going to call a press conference and identify all these mistakes and celebrate how much of a failure you are. Instead, all the Republicans, as well as the Democrats, came to me and said, yeah, we get it. You're starting to show promise here. We'll fix this. And it turns out anytime you do something big and transformative, redoing healthcare, transforming the energy foundation of a society, you will make mistakes. And again, one of the things I'm most horrified by of our current political moment, and it's true in a number of countries, but notably in the US, is the unwillingness of anyone to admit error. It should be obvious that you make mistakes and that you should say, let's fix them together and go forward. But we have a broken political system, again, especially in the US, that makes that impossible. And I think the key in Connecticut was reframing around a common agenda, clean energy, a willingness to go forward in a spirit of experimentation and innovation, knowing that not everything would work, and a commitment to fix what didn't work. And by the way, some parts of the effort we dropped because it became clear it was so hopeless. And then redeploy capital. Again, why governments spend good money after bad and keep spending on the same programs year after year is a profoundly disturbing question to me. And no business can do that. Any management team that keeps spending money on failing marketing gets booted out. Or the boss fires the guy if he's the marketing person. He doesn't figure out that there's a better way forward. So innovation combined with self-reflection, quantitative measurement of success, and really using that to manage forward, I think is key. Please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your remarks and synthesizing 25 years of experience in such a understandable way. I wanted to come back to, you kind of briefly went beyond climate mitigation and spoke about climate adaptation. And maybe I would ask you to talk about that in the context of the Green Bank and how you finance this project. So I think you probably couldn't get away from actually acknowledging climate change in that situation. And some of my work with electric companies that are looking to enhance their resiliency to climate change, they really struggle with getting cost recovery for those investments from their regulators.
It's true. So one of the keys to the Green Bank model is that it works best on investments that have some flow of funds that come from them. So if you put a solar array on a roof, there's electricity to be sold, and that effectively pays for the investment. Much harder on something like moving a substation because it's now exposed to a risk of flooding in a storm, because that's kind of just a dead loss, and somebody has to pay for it. And I think the answer is you have to lay the groundwork for that conversation and have people understand that this is a choice about whether to spend the money now preemptively or be at risk of having an important piece of infrastructure taken out and perhaps create outages that go on for days or weeks or months. And so I did talk, not in the context of the Green Bank, but in Connecticut we had an adaptation strategy that we developed, particularly with the coastal communities that were most exposed. And we did talk about climate change in that context. And we did say, and again, here's what I will tell you I learned. There were environmentalists who wanted us to announce a strategy of retreat from the coastline. But in my spirit of optimism, not pessimism, I found that nobody but a tiny fraction of environmentalists thought retreat was a good rallying point. What did work was resiliency. So again, just as only 2% want retreat, 90% want resiliency. And actually, if you say to people, this is effectively buying insurance, that worked too. Everyone gets the concept of insurance. You know, you don't get a payback now, but you get protected against a bad thing in the future. So I found resiliency and insurance were the framing that was successful. Retreat from the coastline, not good.
I worked for C40 Finance Initiative last year, and we found that while cities have now or subnational governments have a place at the table, it's really hard for them to mobilize financing. It's the main bottleneck. And I wonder what innovative mechanisms you have come across. We did a lot of maybe creating a development bank for cities or giving them direct access to the funds, but also green bonds and city climate funds like the London Green Fund or NICE. And I was wondering whether you have any success cases to share, especially maybe with regards to adaptation.
So I have 3 things to say about how to strengthen the position of cities that I do think is a critical layer of delivery of changed results on the ground. Number 1, I proposed, and I was not successful, in arguing that the Paris 2015 climate change agreement should be open to mayors to sign. You know, I think that, again, 20th century versus 21st century. In the 20th century, and frankly going back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, international law has been between nation states. But that's, again, too narrow a view of what's required in our 21st century going forward. It makes sense to have presidents and prime ministers sign when they control what has to be taken to fulfill the commitment of the agreement. But as I said on climate change, it turns out presidents and prime ministers have relatively little control over the carbon footprints of their society. So I say, let's ask the people that do make those decisions day to day, mayors, premiers, governors, corporate leaders, to put their name on the bottom of the agreement. And by the way, I would have a separate paragraph at the end. Let the national governments negotiate paragraphs 1 to 169, have one paragraph that says, I, as the mayor of Montreal, commit my city to the fullest extent of my authority to fulfilling the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. That's all I want. And now this guy has locked himself in and by the way, the mayor of Montreal, very excited about climate change, very energetic, and was at Paris and will follow through. But I think part of what you need is to have a signal of public commitment and a societal engagement around the mayor. And the mayor can go back and say, I want you to know I was in Paris, I signed up our city, I need all of you to help, because it's the real strategy here is broader engagement. And what I also learned in the failure of my 1992 effort on climate change was that the problem of climate change is too big to rest on a small number of shoulders. You need a lot of people and a lot of institutions out and in the action. So formal signature by mayors, governors, premiers, corporate leaders. And again, only to the strategy, not to any detail. Number two, I do think finance is key. And I think this green bank model could be extended. And why not have a C40 green bank?
I think that's what they're doing.
Create a funding source that 90 cities can all tap into. And by the way, why does that work? They can risk share. And so even if you've got some people that fail, you aren't going to have all fail. And it turns out, again, risk spreading, risk sharing, cost cutting is the key to progress here. And I think finally, the mayors have an opportunity to compare notes, to actually identify best practices, and to highlight what works. And again, in the spirit of comparative data, rack it all up, show who did what worked, what didn't, and then, again, in a spirit of not ordering anyone to do anything, but say, let's have, the mayor of Copenhagen, who has an amazing 100-point climate action plan, stand up and tell us his 3 top ideas. And by the way, it turns out the mayor of Copenhagen is going to speak more easily to the mayor of Montreal than the mayor of Rio de Janeiro. So you separately get the mayor of Rio to stand up and say, here's what we learned, and it might apply in Cape Town. So another of my kind of data principles I've learned is people need to be guided by the success, not in general, but of a relevant peer group, of a relevant peer institution.
Yeah, really good. As one of you who knows Dan for about 36 years now, just a few areas I wanted to comment on. One was that, just to make sure students realize one of the reasons Dan is talking about finance is that normal energy production has a variable cost of natural gas, whatever, but the biggest cost in renewable energy because of fixed asset is the rate of interest. So anything we can do to reduce that, and Dan gives some examples, but one of the examples, what do you think about Dan is, for the negative and for the positive, is that if we can get the auditors to start saying, look, you've got to mention your stranded assets, and hence when they see that sort of hidden liability, and then when the auditors will then say, look, governments have committed to Paris, and hence they have to, and their program is inconsistent with that, or this project links that will lead to banks. So I just wanted to comment on that, and I guess relating to that is, the idea in the United States of municipal bonds, where you get a tax on it. Have you thought of that for the green areas? That was one point I wanted to make. And second was, if things go, we put all this forward, your idea of unanimity is impossible. I mean, so if we get near unanimity, or at least a super majority, but a few big countries relatively are not there, could you see a system where they go to the WTO and start countervailing duties in a sort of last-ditch scenario to get people to move? Whereas, they're for specific business, they're exporting a little bit, where they could force those people like a Boeing to say, look, we have to have our clean energy to produce our thing.
All right, can I answer those before I forget? So number one, I think you're absolutely right that what we need is reporting requirements on risk. And that's how things get translated into investors in capital markets, because you have to reveal your risk. And I think, by the way, the carbon risk is not just that you won't be able to get access to some part of the planetary carbon budget, but it will be of regulatory change. It'll be of changed business opportunities. So if you require people to report on risk, profound effect. And by the way, one of the big battles on university campuses across the United States, I don't know whether it's here or around the world generally, is a divestment movement. So we have students camped out in front of the president of Yale's office who are calling themselves fossil-free Yale, and they every day chant at the president, that they want him to divest from companies that have a high carbon exposure. Well, the investment manager of Yale is a very famous guy, and he said to the president, we can't just do that. That's overly simplified. But here's what he said he would do. Write to all the fund managers for Yale University and ask them how they have managed the issue of carbon exposure. Just a simple question. Please report how you're thinking about carbon exposure in your portfolios. Lo and behold, a year later, they issue the report, and 3 different managers have come to realize there might be an issue with one or another company and have now sold off a piece of their portfolio consistent with the simple request to think about carbon exposure. So it turns out, I think that is a profound strategy, and if you institutionalize it by making it part of reporting requirements and make it a violation of your securities law not to report, could be very profound.
Continuing business part of your audit.
And I think that's where the auditors check to see if you're reporting, and if they find an inconsistency, you're then in violation and it's flagged, and you have to fix it in order to be given a clean audit bill. Number 2, the truth is that a lot of infrastructure, including environmental infrastructure, has been financed by municipal bonds. And that is, by the way, I think a very important strategy in the answer to the city's question and more broadly, that anything that is going to have kind of a value out over time and is hard to finance can be financed with bonds, and should be, because people get a public benefit out over 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So if you ask me, how do you get clean energy infrastructure, but at the same time water infrastructure, waste delivery infrastructure, drinking water, bonds are a good way to do it. Third piece was?
Just WTO.
Yes. I spent the first 10 years of my academic career writing about trade and the environment. So this is a question I've actually thought a lot about. And I believe, although the WTO rules of the past, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade as interpreted in years past, would make it unacceptable to levy a charge at the border for a country that was not meeting greenhouse gas emissions control obligations. And there was a long-time view that you could regulate the products that came into your country, but not the production process. I think we now have a WTO that is evolved in its own thinking, or to put it in legal terms, the jurisprudence has evolved. There's now enough cases that say you can regulate a production process if there is an internationally defined set of obligations that relate to that production process. So I would argue, and am prepared to argue if the WTO gets a case on this, that we now have such an agreement. The Paris Agreement requires everyone to take obligations, and anyone that walks back from the agreement as a whole or falls down on and fails to acknowledge their own commitments would be, I think, open to what's known as border tax adjustment. And that would be the countries who are in the agreement, fulfilling the agreement, would say production in country X that's not following the agreement is in effect subsidized by the failure to expend resources to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when their products come into our market, we will put a countervailing duty on them equal to what we believe the subsidy is, the imputed subsidy of not following through on the Paris Agreement. And I believe the WTO would uphold that today. Now, by the way, this is very controversial, but I think that's a point of battle. And in a world where I said that there's limited enforcement mechanisms, and that's why I'm relying on transparency and metrics and data to expose good behavior to be celebrated and bad behavior to be called out, I think this is one place that you could actually put some teeth behind the agreement. And in my own mind, this is an area that's underdeveloped and needs to be worked through.
So another more legal question. I think you very helpfully outlined that there's a green light approach and a red light approach, and that there's probably a role for both. Because if you look, for instance, at the Montreal Protocol, it was very useful, and it is still very useful to just ban certain substances that deplete the ozone layer.
And by the way, if I could just pause right there, the Montreal Protocol also had green lights and red lights. The green lights being a fund available to help developing countries purchase the chlorofluorocarbon substitutes, the CFC substitutes. And by the way, this is a little known fact, but that fund had a set amount that expanded if China signed up and expanded again if India signed up. So it was actually a specific green light to India and to China to pull them into the agreement. But at the same moment, the red light was not just a ban, but it was trade penalties on countries that either didn't sign up to the agreement or fail to abide by the agreement. And that's what we do not have expressly in the Paris Agreement, but did have in the Montreal Protocol.
Right, yeah. And I think, so there's a role for both. And I wanted to push you a bit on whether there's more of a role for the red light approach when it comes to fossil fuel extraction. Because I think in the renewables field, it does make a lot of sense to catalyze investments in certain ways. But we also know that 80% of proven fossil fuels reserves need to stay in the ground if we want to meet climate targets. So is there more of a role to limit that in a legal way? Or do you think if we go on the green route, that'll prove enough and sufficient?
It's a really interesting question, and I would say one of my other core observations about the failure of environmental efforts of the 20th century, including the failure of climate change, but not limited, was that it relied on governments too much to mandate outcomes. And I think every time governments mandate outcomes, some people get their back up. In fact, there's a whole world of folks who think it's not the government's job to tell them how to do anything. And so they're going to push back and fight very hard against it. So my preferred strategy is to price carbon and to escalate the price over time. And what I'm really trying to do is to drive people by choice to alternatives. Having said that, I hold open the possibility that some things are so profoundly dangerous that they should be banned. I have no tolerance for a price on lead and that you're able to pollute with lead if you're willing to pay a price. It's a public health threat of the highest order. It's the single thing we know most clearly from environmental public health learning in the last 30 years. So I say with regard to lead, just a total ban. I don't know that we're at that point with fossil fuels today, but I could imagine it down the line. But I would first like to try the pricing strategy and try to drive people out. And again, the goal in my mind is to shift the flow of capital to renewables and to the implementing infrastructure of a renewable electricity marketplace. And again, just a couple of things. The president of the Maldives told us today that renewable energy is competitive with fossil fuels. That is not true, except in isolated markets. So again, it's really important to understand that, solar power is up here in cost, wind power is here, and fossil fuels in most places and for baseload energy is lower. So the real goal over time should be to try to have those things cross. And you can do it two ways. Innovation on the solar, wind, and renewables that drives down the cost, or push up the price of the fossil fuel burning. And I would propose doing both, but in the absence of being able to push up the price of fossil fuels, then I want to double down on innovation in the alternatives. And just to be clear, now we're going beyond the law, at the moment that you've got the cleaner option is also cheaper. You don't need laws, regulations, or treaties. The world will shift profoundly and relatively quickly to the now cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable options. So that's why I've emphasized so much this broad vision of innovation to help drive down that cost curve. And to the extent possible, let's push up the cost of the fossil fuels.
You just anticipated my question, which was, could you see a viable political path anytime in the next 5 to 10 years to a predictable, steadily increasing price of carbon?
Yes. So I argued some years back that a couple of reasons why the price signal works. I argued for a $5 per ton carbon charge, escalating by $5 per ton per year for 20 years till you get to $100 a ton. And here's why that is useful in a couple of regards. First, if you try to ban carbon or ban burning fossil fuels, you now have a set of entrenched interests that will fight you to the death. So my number one goal of strategy is to make the change manageable and to have people who are profoundly invested in today's energy status quo get on the bandwagon of change because they can write off over time their investments rather than have them completely lost. And I think one of the other things I've learned in my political life is it helps to have friends, but it's even more helpful not to have enemies. And if you made the fossil fuel people the implacable enemies of your effort, then they do fight you to the death. So this is why I'm probably not in favor in the short run of a ban, in favor of a rising price. The second point is it is profoundly inefficient to try to make change happen fast and much more efficient to make it happen slow and steady. So here's what you get with a $5 per ton rising, escalating price to $100 per ton. In year one, the $5 per ton charge is quite modest in terms of what people pay out in cash. But anyone making an investment decision on a project that has a life of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years looks not at your initial low $5 a ton price, they're factoring in the $100 a ton end price into their investment calculus. And so it changes immediately investment decision making at the sharp, radical level, even though the price is very modest in year one and 2 and 3. So I think this is where innovative policy can get political engagement. And the answer to your question about the politics, and by the way, this is mostly about the United States, which is the biggest political problem, but it turns out a whole set of important Republicans signed up to a New York Times op-ed and to a report last month that said they want a carbon charge. In fact, they want a rising carbon charge of just the kind I described. And that gives me a belief that there is a possibility of a deal to be done, which, by the way, again, for those who are interested in the details of this in the US, the deal I've proposed is this $5 per ton rising carbon charge. Democrats get that, Republicans get to decide what to do with all the money. And completely, the Democrats have to walk away, because all the Democrats want it to be spent on clean energy innovation and supporting this and that. And the deal has to be Republicans get to decide every single dollar. So if they want to cut taxes, cut taxes. They want to redo the corporate tax rate, redo corporate taxes. But you can't expect the Republicans, this is again where Bill McKibben and I would disagree. He would say, well, the Republicans will finally get it and they'll all come on board. I say no. You've got to give them something so big that the deal is worth it for them.
We've got just a couple of minutes left, so we're going to take one.
Really quickly, on one point, then you want to make sure they don't take that $5 and give it as a subsidy to the coal industry. Right? And
All right.
Why didn't you divide between the existing projects and new projects, having 2 carbon prices? One for new projects, one for existing projects.
So the spirit of this question is exactly what I'm arguing for, which is creative policymaking. And I think we have had crude policymaking on a profoundly complex and important issue. Again, no one in business would think they could solve this problem with simplistic answers. They would be thinking about forward purchases, and they'd think about shorting, and they'd be thinking about all kinds of ways to engineer this to sharpen incentives for success. And that's what I'm thinking you guys need to do, is to bring kind of the advanced understandings of a whole set of fields: law, engineering, innovation, behavioral economics, to bear in creating a new set of policy frameworks that will be more successful than the ones I've described as 20th century and limited. All right, what was our last question? Back here, right here.
Just to follow on from the question about legal red lights, at least on the domestic or subnational level, is there still a role of ideas of corporate malfeasance or regulators like the EPA pressuring businesses to engage in internal investigations when they think that they've done something naughty? Is there still a role for those kinds of ideas in incentivizing businesses?
So I think, is it Cleo said, and it's quite right, that I'm actually wanting to add green lights to red lights. So I don't take out the red lights. I think you still have to have rules. And I do think there are some cases of malfeasance, corporate malfeasance, that should be severely punished, like Volkswagen lying about the emissions from the tailpipe of their cars. Especially if you're believing, as I believe, in this information strategy and disclosure as a core element of your regulatory program, then cheating on the information needs to be profoundly punished. I do believe the Volkswagen executives who are involved in this case should go to jail, and when they finish their sentences in California, they should be shipped to France and start serving some sentences there. And when they finish there, they can go to Germany and finish out their lives in jail in Germany. But I'm serious. If you believe that the information strategy is going to work, you have to trust the information. And this, by the way, just as maybe this is a good thought to close on, which is why this strategy works in Europe, in places where you have basic integrity of data, and I am not confident it works in Russia or China at the present time. And so we need to evolve to, and I think there is evolution coming, in China in particular. Again, China is one of the countries that has had the most difficult time accepting a transparency agenda of the kind that's in the Paris Agreement. And yet they finally did, because they are evolving in their role in the world. And again, I don't know how many of you noticed this, but just ahead of the Paris Agreement's conclusion, the Chinese marked up their acknowledged greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. And they said, you know, we told everyone we were emitting here, it's actually up here, folks. Why? Because if they're going to be held to account and have to report, if this is the actual emissions and they promise to go down to here, they have a much bigger distance to go. So it turns out that they needed to get from where they said they were to reality to start their claim of reductions. So again, this is the signal that disclosure works, transparency works, but only if you have effectively a rule of law and a consequence for misinformation and misbehavior behind it.
It's happy that you did not believe in capital punishment.
Oh, those guys would have been close to it. I think it was really a profoundly upsetting.
Raise the issue.
Well, the other thing, last thought though, again, in the spirit of this idea that broader engagement is the key, it was not the EPA that found them. It was the California regulators that found them. And by the way, how did the European regulators not find them when they're much bigger in the European market?
And yes, in Germany, I'm surprised they did not.
It's shocking. And by the way, in France too, what's going on? All right, Delavine,
Well,
thank you.
We're going to continue this discussion down at lunch. Unfortunately, the food at Rhodes House is better than in Copenhagen. Dan, thank you so much.